Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yes.
Probably the most infamous Tennessean who fought in the Civil War. Because I think he's such an important character. And outside of Tennessee, not all that many people know about him. And I think if you don't know about him, you can't understand the Civil War. And you also can't understand what happens afterward with Reconstruction and with the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
So here's the basic
So who is
short
this guy?
story. Who is this guy? And why is there a Confederate battle
Is that
flag
the statue
behind
of him right there? Well, no, it's like a girl on a horse.
That is literally the ugliest statue of him ever, though it's recently
Click on that.
it's been moved. It's
Holy shit! What the?
it is the most ridiculous
That's
statue.
terrible.
It's
like
near Nashville.
It's like they couldn't afford the professional.
I mean, there's
Oh
so
my
many
God.
there's so many other reasons why this is the worst statue of all time, like historical reasons. But
I mean, it's-
aesthetically, visually, it makes you want to barf.
It's not even like a proportional human. Like, look at the size of his head.
So my students actually told me recently that the statue is gone. Like, it used to be very visible on the interstate driving near Nashville. Someone had painted it hot pink recently. The last that
there
I
it
saw.
is.
There it is. Yeah. But from what I've heard, that statue is no longer there. I can't confirm that personally because I don't drive around Nashville all that much. But
What did
I
they
think
write
it's
on
gone.
Oh,
Zoom in.
I
Oh, you can't zoom.
Yeah.
No, it won't let me.
Oh man.
So
It
here's
says
the
monster.
deal.
No, it says monster.
Oh,
Huh?
monster.
Monster
Okay.
down the legs.
They really nailed it with Monster. So who is this guy? Who's Nathan Bedford Forrest?
Right.
And when I tell you the story, it's going to blow your mind, especially the kind of post, the later parts of the story. So Nathan Bedford Forrest is from Tennessee, and he's born into pretty humble circumstances. He's not a super rich guy, but he has this astronomical rise to wealth and fame through his profession, through what he does for a living. And what does he do for a living? He's a slave trader. Right? He is, in fact, the most profitable slave trader in the city of Memphis before the Civil War.
So
And
he's
is
like a
major-
middleman?
He's a guy like auctioning off, like selling human beings, right? Like
Okay.
he's like, no one is profiting more from the institution of slavery than Nathan Bedford Forrest.
So-
Like, he's out there. He owns people. He's kind of a middleman, right? I
So
mean,
if he grew up in humble beginnings, how did he get to own all these slaves?
through hard work, if you can call it that, in this awful profession. But he builds a sort of empire. He finds himself, speculating and gaining more wealth through human property that he makes. I think he's earning about $100,000 a year by 1850s dollars, which is a shitload of money, right?
So
he's a
relative to
millionaire.
today. Oh no,
Multi-million.
100. Oh, so
He's a multi-millionaire
Oh, wow.
in 1850s Memphis.
this might be a stupid question, but relative to today, what was the cost of a slave?
Let me see. I want to say, and I have to check back on the numbers here, that would probably be about 1,000. You know what? I mean, I can't pull the statistic up, but they're expensive, right?
We're going to ask Reddit here.
Okay, so about
There.
How much did slaves in America cost in today's money? And the real price of a slave in 1850 is around $12,000 in today's money. And the net earnings of owning a single slave is around $82,000.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily trust Reddit
Right.
as our first source.
Damn
here.
it.
But here's the deal. I mean, the whole system is so toxic, right? I mean, how do you possibly quantify a human being's worth?
Yeah, this Quora thing says generally around 500 for a young adult male and 1,000 for what? I can't see it now. I made it too small.
So listen to this. This is really fascinating. At the eve of the Civil War, the value of enslaved people was the single greatest piece of wealth in the South. Like much more than land, much more than cotton. Most of the planters, like the aristocracy in the South, most of their wealth lay in enslaved people, which means that by 1865, when that institution is gone and all that money disappears, the South gets enormously much poorer as a result, because like the amount of property, quote unquote, just disappeared.
Right.
So buying enslaved people, it was not cheap in that you needed to have money and resources, which is why Nathan Bedford Forrest is earning so much money selling people. Really, he's selling people primarily from the eastern seaboard, from old slaveholding states like Virginia, like North Carolina, toward the kind of boom zones of the South, which is Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, like places that have been recently settled. You know the phrase being sold down the river, like it's kind of a bad thing happening to you?
Yeah.
That's literally a reference to enslaved people being sold from the eastern parts of the South into the kind of southwestern parts of the South, because that's where all the money, that's where all the cotton, that's where all the boom is going on. So someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, they're making money transferring human beings, enslaved human beings, from the kind of old core of slavery in Virginia to the new kind of glowing center
In the
of-
West.
Yeah, in places like the Mississippi Delta,
So
like
if you're
in
a
Louisiana.
if you're a slave owner in like Tennessee or Georgia or something like that, and you got a lot of slaves, you would essentially, so assuming that they bought them for a price a couple years ago, they would say, okay, I have too many, I'll sell them for a profit.
Yeah, the value as this toxic market, quantified, was far higher in the Mississippi Delta than in Eastern Virginia.
Okay.
Right, or Eastern North Carolina.
Okay.
So that's how Forrest is making his money, right?
Wow.
He is actively profiting from the forced relocation, right? Breaking up of families, the tearing apart of people's lives, to siphon them, selling them down the river, quite literally, to the west. He became this really famous and rich guy. So when the Civil War breaks out, no one at all was shocked. What side is he going to pick, right?
Right.
Like, guy who makes his entire living off of the practice of slavery. Of course,
Right.
he's going to be a fervent supporter of the Confederacy, which he is. And he joins the military, and he rises in the ranking of the military, so that he is a commander. I can't remember what his precise title was.
You can probably find it, Steve.
Yeah, I'm sure he can dig it up. But he's a cavalry officer in the.
Who's the dude?
Forrest.
This is Nathan Bedford Forrest
Oh,
again.
Nathan.
What was his full title in the Confederacy? I'm blanking on it at the moment.
Nathan Bedford
Confederate
Forrest.
general.
Is he a general?
Will Wikipedia tell us the truth about him?
He's a high up guy. I'll tell you that much.
Okay.
Confederate Army general. Oh, well, he'll have his thingy down here. Specifically,
Yeah,
He
Lieutenant
was a
General.
Freemason.
Lieutenant General. So one of the most infamous moments in the Civil War involves this guy. Okay, so it's in 1864. I want to say he is commanded to take this fort in western Tennessee that's on the banks of the Mississippi River called Fort Pillow. And Fort Pillow was one of these forts that the U.S. Army had taken really early on in the war, because the U.S. tries to get control of the Mississippi River as soon as possible, because they want to basically choke off the South. Like they've got
Right.
a blockade on the Atlantic, and they want to choke them from the western side by gaining control of the river, which they do quite early on. But their control of that is weakening by 1864. And Forrest is given the task of retaking this fort in western Tennessee, pretty close to Memphis, called Fort Pillow. And he's eager to do this because he knows that the U.S. soldiers who are holding this fort at Fort Pillow are in large part African American, right? That there's hundreds of U.S. colored troops who are holding this fort, right? And he, his relationship with black people. He's made his living selling their literal bodies, right? So he has a tremendous grudge against any black person who would A, defy the Confederacy, and B, try to destroy the Confederacy by joining the U.S. Army. So when he attacks this fort in 1864, the U.S. he has the upper hand in the battle. Right, it's pretty obvious that the Confederate cavalry is going to take this fort, and they do. The U.S. troops inside begin surrendering, expecting to be spared, right? Expecting to become prisoners.
Right.
But Forrest wants to send a message. Right? He wants to send a message by executing nearly all of the African American troops fighting in resisting the Confederacy in that fort. So this becomes not just the Battle of Fort Pillow; it's the massacre of Fort Pillow, where I think about 150 or so black troops are shot execution style by Forrest and his men. Right? People who are surrendering. Right? People like the battle is over, and quote, Forrest says this again. I'm not making this stuff up. He says the battlefield has to be dyed with the blood, of black soldiers to prove that black people can't resist the Confederacy or whatever. So he wants to send a message. Like he's engaging in terrorism essentially, right? He wants to send his violent message,
Of course.
so that there's going to be ripple waves of fear against any other black Southerners who would consider joining the U.S. Army. It backfires against him, though, right? Because people do remember Fort Pillow, but they do so as kind of a battle call to get black Southerners to join the army rather than that. Like, you heard "Remember the Alamo," right? Remember Fort Pillow was something you would hear both in northern and southern black communities as a rationale to join the army.
It was a recruiting mechanism.
Exactly, right? So Forrest wanted the opposite. Now, what about Forrest? Why are these statues all over him, all over the South? I mean, yeah, he's this kind of, big Confederate cavalry general. Well, after the war, his career continues. Because in 1867, the Ku Klux Klan, this newly founded white supremacist terrorist organization, they meet in Nashville to elect their first Grand Wizard. Who do they pick? Nathan Bedford Forrest.
When was the Ku Klux Klan formed? What year?
In 1866. That's really
so
when
the year after the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly. In Tennessee as well. And so he's symbolically elected their first Grand Wizard, their first leader. Right, so this is a guy. He's a slave trader. He's a Confederate, butcher. If you look at Fort Pillow, to be sure, and then he's the leader of the first leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow!
Listen to this. Until 2020, the state of Tennessee, the governor of the state of Tennessee, was required to pronounce that his birthday was Nathan Bedford Forrest Day. Which means that the first 7 years that I lived in Tennessee until 2020, there would be a Nathan Bedford Forrest Day that people would be
on his birthday.
Would be that the state was meant to celebrate this dude until literally 4 years ago, right? His bust was in the Tennessee Capitol in Nashville, like formally there. Wow. What message do you think that sends to anybody about what the state, was championing?
That's wild.
Yeah.
And is this something that just nobody talked about? Because I'm sure if you had a conversation,
people talked about it.
Oh, really?
Well, African Americans had been pushing to remove this guy and to end his holiday forever, right? They're like, this is an insult. Like Tennessee has a large black community, like any southern state, like any American state, but especially so in the South. So they've been fighting from the beginning to get rid of this stuff.
And what was the pushback?
Oh, this is heritage, not hate. Right? It's like this old debate about the Confederate battle flag. I mean, Mississippi only removed the Confederate battle flag from its state flag like 2 years ago or something, like in the midst of Black Lives Matter. That's how long it took for them to get rid of that thing. So there's, these myths die hard. They dig down deep. The lost cause, this sort of, alternate explanation of the Civil War, it would have a powerful reverberations. But it's really important that we extricate that stuff, right? Like, we can't let that stuff haunt our society. I mean, we didn't be aware of it, but to celebrate Nathan Bedford Forrest.
To have a national day about Nathan Bedford Forrest, a guy who just slaughtered a bunch of black people because they were fighting them in a war, is ridiculous. But what do you think about, like, where to draw, like, the question of where to draw the line with having memorials or statues of these people, whether let's say they did something good, right? Like
Thomas Jefferson.
Like Thomas Jefferson, right? But at the same time, they also had this dark side where they were slave owners. Well,
I'm going to primarily address the question of Civil War Confederate statues, right? Because, Confederates were literally rebels. I mean, they were enemies of the United States, right? So that puts them in a different camp from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were the founders of the United States, right? All slaveholders, but one were, traitors who were betraying the United States, and others were not. So I'm going to focus on the Civil War stuff. To me, what really shapes that whole debate is that those statues came up at a particular moment. Like, to me, it matters that they came up in 1895, 1910, like this turn of the century moment, that they did not go up right after the Civil War. So it's like at this moment when when history is being weaponized and militarized to protect white supremacy, which is like why those statues came up in the 1890s at that moment, because they wanted to solidify white control and white power. Because they come around at that precise moment, we have to think about them very differently than if they came around in 1865 or something, like during the Civil War. So because those statues were deeply political at the moment that they were built, that they were trying to broadcast a message, and in fact, black people at the time wrote about this. Like, they were very aware of this. Like, when those statues start popping up in the 1890s and 1900s, they knew. I mean, I have quotes, that I've found, black people saying, well, it's really just white people talking to us about Jim Crow with those statues, right? They're trying to send a message of, hey, white supremacy is the system that defines the South. So given what those statues were trying to do at the particular moment, like 30, 40 years after the Civil War, it's not just about that suddenly means what we're debating is not just about the Civil War. We're actually debating the 1890s and 1900s. And that's a much easier conversation in some ways to have because it makes them just look so unequivocally nasty, right?
Yes.
These statues.
Right.
Same with the Confederate battle flag, right? Like when we talk about the Confederate battle flag, we're not just talking about the Civil War. Yeah, we're talking about the 1890s, like when Florida puts that on its flag. But we're also talking about the 1950s and 1960s when that symbol gets pulled in again on the behalf of segregationists and white supremacists to send another political message, right? Like Georgia puts that Confederate battle flag on its state flag in 1955. 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case says segregation is illegal, right? So all of these states are like, are taking these symbols and making it do political work for them at that particular moment. So for me, this debate is not just about the Civil War, it's about times after it, when it's so obvious that this is about race, and not just about race, but racial exploitation and white supremacy, right? So for me, that reason is simple, that those statues have to go. I'm not saying you have to destroy them. You could move them to a museum, right? Where you put a lot of context and plaques all around that help you understand why did they come up at that moment. But to keep them there in place as is without context, to me, that's kind of reinforcing the messages that they were meant to send in 1905, right? And we do not want to send those messages.
Right. But it's at the same time, it's important to tell those stories and not forget the stories of evil and bad things that were done, so we can remember not to do them in the future.
Right. I mean, think about it. There's so many figures in American history who are deeply complicated.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, for example, right, who's president in the World War I era. He's a white Southern racist. There's no denying it. Like, he was a fan of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, he never joined or anything. But he looked positively upon, their work, who believed that Reconstruction was this great mistake, that black people didn't deserve political power. Woodrow Wilson is the guy who, formally segregates Washington, D.C., brings Jim Crow to D.C., to the federal government. But then he's also, a guy who does a lot of good things too. He's a major, part of the Democratic Party in the 20th century. He is a guy who, helps defeat Germany in World War I, wants to put into place this international system, the League of Nations, that was going to end warfare. He does some positive things.
Right.
How do we deal with him? Do we just cancel him completely? No, I don't think that's possible, Same with Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of the founder. Well, that's a whole other conversation. But I just think we need to have open conversations about the nasty stuff, and then also acknowledge that, people are also capable of doing positive things that ripple out to us today.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And this is I can't stop thinking about what I was thinking about before we started this podcast was and again, just to clarify, this is not a very well-formed thought, but the first thing that came to mind when I started reading this stuff is that today, even though racism has gotten a lot better compared to what it was in the Civil War era, it's still a super hot, explosive topic in today's culture. And there's nothing you can say about somebody that is as bad as calling them a racist.
Right.
I guess is just so interesting to me is that the human race is just plagued with evil, atrocious sins that we've committed on each other throughout history. Yet those topics aren't as explosive as the topic of just racism in the last 200 years of America.
But none are equally powerful to the problem of race in the last 200 years of American history as it shapes our lives, right? I mean, yes, Greek pedophilia of 2,000 years ago is interesting and important in its own way, but our country was so profoundly shaped by the institution of slavery and by the imposition and the continued imposition of white supremacy as a legal system in the decades and century after that. I mean, I get that people feel oh, it's an obsession, but it has to be so, because we have to grapple with this on a daily basis. And you know what? Americans have always been grappling with this. And in my book,
it's like an epigenetic curse.
It's something that Americans have felt the need to talk about for a long time. You know, it blows me away that like the best-selling book of the 1800s that was written during the 1800s was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a book about slavery. Then the best-selling book of the 1900s written in that century is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which is also about slavery and race.
Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of folks out there today who want Americans to talk less about racism, to talk less about slavery. And, you know, there's forces out there, some of them which are in Florida, especially, given the leadership of the state, who want to have fewer conversations about that. But the reality is that these are fundamental to understanding American history, and that if we try to sweep them under the rug, we're never going to come to terms with them. So it's really essential that Americans continue to talk about race, but to do so in a more enlightened and welcoming and open manner than they have before, because they haven't really been talking about it for a long time.
Has it been taken out of the school curriculum or something?
Well, there's big battles over school education codes and everything. That
what would the argument be against it? So teaching. So are they saying that teaching the true history of America, like what really happened during the Civil War, is like not appropriate for kids?
Yeah, and that it makes people bitter, that it divides our society, that it makes people upset. Well,
interesting.
You have to get upset about this.
Yeah.
If we don't get upset about it, how can we reject the legacy of it, right? I mean, we live in a society that's haunted by these patterns, and we have to have an open conversation about how to eliminate them.
Their argument is that we shouldn't teach the truth about American history because we need to forget it?
I think some people would probably agree with that. I'm not one of them.
No, I don't
right?
think
I don't think
it's right to forget about history.
As a historian, you have to teach the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I mean, that means including the good too, right? There's good in many of these periods that we can find, but to make ourselves feel content and sort of pat ourselves on the back in order to erase and submerge histories is a really dangerous thing to do.
Yeah,
I really believe that.
Is this is something that I'm super unfamiliar with and haven't been paying attention to, but the critical race theory idea, which side of that argument is the critical race? Is that critical race theory, are they saying that you need to teach the truth about history, or are they saying that we should forget about history? Here's
the thing. Critical race theory is this legal studies field that's super niche that I will be honest, I never even heard of until about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's not something that's like dominating the academy.
Okay.
What it's become is a boogeyman for conservatives to say, oh, here's this catchy phrase that most of them probably don't even understand because they don't read this stuff.
Do we know the definition of it?
I mean, if you work in this particular field, which is not all that many people, then they're interested in. Look, I'm a historian. I don't work in critical race theory by any means. But what I do is I study American history, right? And that in which race plays a really important and an influential role. So, basically, it's been this catchphrase that people have leapt onto to say, oh, there's this campaign, to make white people feel bad about U.S. history. And
to make white people feel bad about
that's
US
how it's
history.
used in conservative circles, in kind of political rhetoric or so. It's not actually something that very many high school or even college teachers are actively doing. Some are, to be sure. And those people who are doing that, they're you were wondering what sides they would be on, right? They'd be pushing, not just for telling the true history, but for looking at things like, subconscious racism, microaggressions, various ways that, racism reproduces itself in less obvious ways, right? So people in that field work on that. But it's really not what I'm doing. It's not what most historians are doing. But basically, I think a lot of folks on the right in the U.S. have swooped down on this kind of very, very small subfield and argued that, oh, well, this is what every high school teacher and every college instructor is doing, when this is really not actually the case. However, we historians do place race as a central and powerful actor and factor in American history, and it's impossible to teach it without doing that.
Yeah.
Right? Does that mean we're doing critical race theory? No. But it means that we're having hard and open conversations about race in the past, which is really necessary.
Right.
And thankfully, Red Dead Redemption 2, the video game, can prove an important sort of window to open and have those conversations and debates. And that's a lot of what my book tries to do.
Even Lincoln wrote a lot about that. Like, he still believed that they didn't deserve to be equal to everyone else. They didn't deserve to vote or anything like that. He just wanted to abolish slavery. That was it, right?
Well, it depends, right? So like Lincoln is a character who changes a lot over his career.
Okay.
So if you check in with Lincoln like in 1860 when he runs for president and gets elected, he is not an anti-slavery. He's not an abolitionist. He's not like, we need to remove slavery immediately.
Okay.
However, by 1865, the last year of his life, that's what he does. He literally abolishes slavery, right? Through the first Emancipation Proclamation and then through the 13th Amendment. And so you might think, like, 5 years, how could someone change so much? Well, the course of the war changes him, and it changes a lot of Republicans, people of his party at that time as well, right? Because he sees, the ways that African Americans were so doggedly devoted to freedom and to assisting the United States in this cause, seeing their humanity, seeing their bravery, seeing their dedication to this struggle. That's what tilted him and many, many thousands of other white Northerners to be like, wow, like, we started this war to preserve the Union, but now we're fighting it by 1865 to destroy slavery permanently and forever. So there's a real change in thinking on the part of these folks.
It happened like mid-war?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is the craziest thing. Early in the Civil War, Union U.S. troops would return escaped slaves to southern plantations. They're like, this is your property. We're delivering it back to you. So they're not trying to like destroy slavery right away. They're in fact maintaining it, in part because they're really cautiously watching these border states, places like Kentucky, places like Missouri that did not secede from the U.S., but these were places that had slavery, right? Yeah. So Lincoln is very careful not to lose those states. He doesn't want to see them tilting into the Confederate camp. Right. So they really tiptoe around the question of slavery in the beginning. They're like, we don't want to mess with this institution. We just want to defeat the Confederacy and get the South back in the Union.
Right.
So but by the end of the war, that's not where they're at, right? By the end of the war, they're really aggressively going against slavery as an institution.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, right, that like in 1865, white Northerners kind of give up on the question of racial equality. I wouldn't agree with that quite, because in the decade or 15 years that follows comes Reconstruction, right? And Reconstruction is this fundamental turning point when the U.S., now that it's unified again, the U.S. government really tries to remake the South. And they pass some of the most important legislation that's still shaping our world today. Now, I said earlier, right, that you can't understand race in America today if you don't understand that kind of moment after the Civil War. And that's because the crucial constitutional amendments that shape our lives today were passed in that very period. So, for example, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment establishes birthright citizenship, that if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. Right? This is something that's being debated today regarding undocumented immigration and all sorts of things, right? But it's passed in the midst of, and it's really passed to give black people in the United States citizenship. It's part of Reconstruction. It's part of this like idealistic moment when the U.S. tries to reform the South and really the whole nation in the wake of the Civil War. And the great sort of irony of Reconstruction, this period that's really dates between 1865 or so and 1877, so like, roughly 12 years after the war, is that the United States wins the Civil War, but it kind of loses the peace in that it fails to achieve most of its goals with Reconstruction. It accomplishes many of them, but the big picture, when the South kind of returns to white domestic rule in the 1870s and 80s, there's a lot of similarities between, slavery's gone, but white Southerners are now back in control, and they kind of win the peace, even if they'd lost the war, which is one of the great, ironies of the Civil War in many ways.
What do you mean by that last statement? They lost the war, but they won the peace?
Yeah. So white Southerners, the Confederacy is defeated in the Civil War, right? That's inarguable. But what they do is they win the terms of the peace by forcing the United States to back off from Reconstruction. Because Reconstruction does two things, right? It makes black people into citizens, and it makes black men into voters. It says, black men can vote, right? After 1870, that is official. And that was revolutionary, right? Because if you look at other societies that had slavery in the Americas, Cuba, Brazil, Jamaica, all these other places, they do not end slavery immediately and then make black men into full voters. It takes a lot longer for that to happen. So the U.S. goes like really quickly into that reform and, you know, extends democracy to black men, not women yet, right? But black men. And what the South wins in terms of winning the peace is that it basically forces the United States government to back away from some of those promises about racial equality.
Okay.
And it won't be until the 1890s that they fully shut out black people from voting and from citizenship in many ways. But because the U.S. by 1877 has largely signaled that they're not going to, you know, really enforce these constitutional amendments from Reconstruction, it means that white Southerners, they do win the peace in some regard. They're able to preserve white supremacy, white control over Southern society in ways that, you know, Lincoln would have turned over in his grave to see, right? Because this is not the desired outcome, to be sure.
Right. Which you mentioned that it kind of changed for him during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sure that, you know, you witness, because what were the basic, like the premise or the ideals that the Confederacy was fighting for? Like why, like for me and people that aren't super, you know, knowledgeable about this stuff, what were they like? What were their values or their ideals that were behind their fight?
Right. Well, there was one ideal above all others that motivated these elite white Southerners to secede from the U.S. and to create the Confederacy, and that was to preserve a future for slavery. That is really, I mean, you look at the documents of the people who create the Confederacy, like their founding statues, their speeches, their declarations, they do not hide their motives. They're like, we are creating a new republic based on the truth, you know, that the black man is subservient and lower than the white man. Like they say this. It's all in the documents there.
But that's not what the U.S. was fighting for.
The U.S. begins the war fighting to preserve the Union, right? That's like,
the Union.
Yeah, to keep the South from leaving, like to keep the country together. That's what the war begins as. And then over the course of the war becomes a war against slavery, and for some people, a war for racial equality. Not everybody, right? But enough people that they were able to push through these Reconstruction amendments. So the real, I mean, you know, this is
there's documents that you've read that basically they're saying that we're fighting for the future of slavery.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, the reason they left is because they were worried about the future of slavery, not just in the U.S., but potentially abroad, you know, in places in Latin America as well. But see, this is the source of like a great deal of mythology.
Yeah. Is this contested at all?
Not by any serious historian.
Okay.
But by a lot of people out there, right? So basically, as soon as the Civil War is over, folks in the South, white folks in the South, begin creating this counter-narrative that's basically helping them rationalize defeat, that's helping them make sense out of what happened. And they're saying, you know what? Since the war's over, slavery's been destroyed, right? They don't want to say, well, we fought for this, you know, vicious, sinful cause and we got defeated. Instead, as they claimed, we were doing it for states' rights. You know, so there comes out this counter-narrative. It's like the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about political principles, and particularly about limited government and states' rights.
States' rights.
That states' rights have the power to choose and make decisions, not the federal government, right? So this is a narrative that historians often call the lost cause. And I have a whole chapter in my book about this, actually, because Red Dead Redemption 2 touches on this in really interesting ways. So it's this white counter-narrative that the Civil War was not a sort of, you know, a racist defense of slavery, but it was a defense of truly American principles of small government and states' rights. Now, the reason we know that this is total bullshit, which it really was, this has nothing to do with why the South actually seceded. Let me give just two examples. So in 1850, so this is 10 years before the Civil War breaks out, in 1850, the South, the white South, pushes through this bill called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act, what it basically did is it actually really strengthened the federal government to go and pursue escaped enslaved people across state lines. It gives the federal government tons of muscle and power to like walk all over state jurisdictions trying to catch runaways.
Okay.
How is that states' rights? Right? That is literally the inverse of states' rights. It is a defense of slavery,
right,
primarily.
By the federal government.
Well, by the U.S. government, of which the South is a part of, right, at that point in 1850.
Right.
So basically they're saying, you know, hey, we want a muscular federal government when it protects slavery. However, if it's critiquing slavery, now we don't like the government anymore. This is an age-old story in much of white Southern history. So that's, and some of the same people who push for this Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, there's some of the same people who are seceding in 1861, right? So like it can't be states' rights in 1861 and federal government all powerful in 1850. That doesn't make any sense.
No, that doesn't make any sense.
The other way we can know that this kind of states' rights, not slavery story is BS is let's actually look at the country they create. Let's look at the Confederate States of America, right, which has its own constitution, has its own founding documents. It's a really centralized government where the federal state has a lot of power in order to win this war, in order to protect slavery.
Right.
So if they really believed in states' right, wouldn't they practice what they preached, right? Wouldn't they like really enact those ideals now that they have their own government? And they don't, because see, this is a battle that like if you teach American history in the South, especially, but it's really around the country, you're going to confront a lot of students who say, "Oh, my parents told me the South didn't fight the war for slavery. It's not about that. It's about states' rights." And then I have to like patiently and carefully basically prove how that's totally wrong. It's just not borne out by history. It is a fictional narrative that people in the South create after the war to try to rationalize what happened. I mean, Florida is very much part of the South, to be sure. And no one before World War II would have thought of Florida as an appendage of New York. Right? That's only a recent thing. Really only in the last like 50 years or so. The Florida secedes. It's part of the Confederacy. Just look at Florida's state flag. On Florida's state flag, you'll see that red cross of St. Andrews.
Can you pull that up, Steve? The Florida flag? I need some history on Florida.
White background with a red St. Andrews cross in the middle.
Okay.
That's the same cross you see on the Confederate battle flag.
That's the Confederate cross.
Shit, look at that.
It's basically the same state flag as Alabama. You can pull up the Alabama state flag. It is virtually identical to Florida's, aside from the seal. The seal is, of course, different. By the way, both Florida and Alabama put that St. Andrew's cross on their state flag not right after the Civil War, but actually in the 1890s. They do it right within the same years, and that's in the 1890s as well.
And that's the Reconstruction period?
This is after Reconstruction.
After Reconstruction,
yeah, because Reconstruction really winds down in the late 1870s. So in the 1890s, Mississippi puts the full-on Confederate battle flag on its state flag, and then Alabama and Florida put it kind of like halfway on with just that cross.
They were 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Yeah, and you might wonder, like, wait, why would these? So talking about the Confederate battle flag is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah,
there's so much mythology.
There's so much mythology and confusion.
Yeah, and it's just so much like actively toxic deception relating to this flag. But so these three states put that banner on their state flags in the 1890s. Okay. And there's a very simple reason why. Because in the 1890s, they felt that white supremacy was under attack and under threat in their societies. And they wanted to kind of bolster white unity and to make a common front against black success and black challenges in the political spectrum. The 1890s, so this is why I'm so fascinated with Red Dead Redemption 2 and the fact that it's also a Southern game and a Western game. People, the stereotype of Red Dead 2 is that, it's a Western, it's a cowboy game. Well, yeah, sure, it is that in some senses. But then a huge chunk of the game plays out in the Deep South in the 1890s. Like the 1890s is that same decade that Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi put that Confederate battle flag on their state flags.
Oh, wow.
So this is like a really important decade in Southern history. I think when we think about big decades in Southern history, we think about the 1860s, the Civil War, or the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. But I would say the 1890s is actually the third most important decade in Southern history, because it's at this moment that white supremacy, white rule, white power comes under tremendous threat. And as a result, there's this huge backlash to try to, reshape Southern society to bolster and reinforce white supremacy. So the flags have everything to do with this. It's in the 1890s that the South also begins building these monuments to the Confederacy, right? Like these big, tall statues that have been getting torn down in the last, 5 years. Yeah. Those start coming up in the 1890s, not in the 1860s or 70s, not right after the war, in the 1890s, like a full 30 years after the Civil War is over. In the 1890s is when the first Jim Crow laws are passed. It is when, you see those signs that say for colored, for white, right? Those did not exist really systematically until the 1890s. In the 1890s is when they begin popping up. So the 1890s is this moment of tremendous change in Southern history, where there's a threat from below, basically a threat of poor whites and poor blacks potentially coming together to challenge the bigger system, and then this tremendous backlash, which brings Confederate flags on on state flags, which brings statues, which brings all the Jim Crow laws, this total reorganization of the South, which is then going to stay in place for the next 70 years until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s.
Can you give me just the 30,000 foot overview of the history of the origin of the Jim Crow?
Yeah,
comes from a comedian play or something.
Right. So Jim Crow is not actually a real person.
Right.
It was a character in minstrelsy shows. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's minstrelsy is something most Americans don't know much about.
Right.
It's best that we forget it. It's something that tried to sweep under the rug. But minstrelsy is really America's first pop music genre. It starts in the 1820s and 1830s.
Minstrelsy?
It's white people putting on blackface and singing songs about black people that's meant to parody them and belittle them and this sort of thing. And this is not just a Southern thing. This is an American thing. It's in New York.
Minstrel.
In New York City, you could go to minstrel shows in the 1830s and 40s. That'd be wildly popular. So one of the common characters in these minstrel shows was a character named Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And he was meant to be, this sort of stereotypical, uneducated, backwards African American.
Okay.
So when these laws start coming around in the 1890s, people start calling them Jim Crow laws because, they're kind of tangled up with this older history of racism.
Was there a proper name for them, or how did Jim Crow laws stick? Obviously,
they're not formally called that. When the states passed them, they're called segregation
statutes. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
and now we just call them Jim Crow laws because
right, exactly. Yeah, so it's interesting. You might imagine that Southern society had always been totally segregated, and that wasn't actually true. Under slavery, for example, black and white people were often close proximity with one another. They're often, African Americans worked in white homes. They nursed white children. They're
really nursed them?
You have evidence of this happening. Yeah, to be sure, of wet nurses who would be engaged in homes. So there was very close physical contact between people, right? So then slavery ends in the South, leaves the Civil War era. And some things are initially segregated. For example, schools. First off, there wasn't much schooling at all going on in this period. Right. Very little public budgets for education. But when the first schools are created with public resources, then they're separate, right? So that happens as soon after the Civil War. And churches also tend to segregate after the Civil War. That you have black churches and white churches. Mm-hmm. But then there were lots of things that were not segregated. And really, there's this 30-year window after the Civil War when things are really fluid. Things are really unpredictable. When train cars were not segregated, when trolley cars are not segregated, when stores are not segregated, when waiting rooms are not segregated, restaurants, well, that was a little trickier. But it's only in the 1890s that you see a systematic effort to put into place massive public segregation, right? The kind that we think of, when we think of the South after the Civil War. But it only comes together quite a bit afterward. And you might wonder, why is that happening? Again, it comes back to this fear of a threat that's going to shake the foundations of the South and of white supremacy.
And this wasn't going on in the North.
Well, there was already segregation in many northern states already. Yeah. Okay. So that, in many ways, the South kind of imports a northern practice of segregation. So this is not a uniquely Southern institution, though it's much more. It's entrenched and legalized in law much more so in the South after the 1890s than it ever was in the North. Right. But there was plenty of discrimination and rules against black folks in northern states too.
So what year was this war between Mexico and the U.S.?
1846 to 1848.
1846.
So it's right before. Actually, this war is what causes the Civil War more than anything. You might be like, wait,
how?
Because you remember that map, right? All that green that the U.S. swallows?
Yes.
Well, the big question was, are those going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? That was the huge dilemma that people were fighting so viciously about in the 1850s, right? In that decade leading up to the Civil War. it's these reasons that actually help to explain why Texas is such a freaking massive state. Like, I don't know if you've ever driven from like El Paso to like Houston. You're just like, when does the state end? Why is it so big? Why is there nothing quite as big as it? It's all related to the politics of slavery in this time period, because slavery was entrenched in the Texas by the time that Texas becomes a state. But most of the slaveholders wanted Texas to become multiple states, mainly because every state, of course, gets to send 2 senators to Washington and representatives. And those would all be pro-slavery senators, right? So people in other parts of the U.S. in the North were like, no freaking way is Texas coming in as like 6 states, because that's going to tilt the level of power so much in favor of slavery that we'll never have any way to resist. So it's like the agreement was that, okay, Texas comes in as 1 state, a slave state, but that it remains massive. So next time you're driving across it and thinking like, why is it so big? Slavery and the lead up to the Civil War and the Mexican-American War, right? It's land that's taken from Mexico.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's wild.
And then, so how did Mexico and the U.S. agree on where to draw this line and how much of Mexico the U.S. was going to swallow?
Yeah, well, they don't agree. There's a lot of fighting about it, to be sure. And there's some extra, there's disputes that last for decades and decades afterward. But, the U.S. militarily wins the Mexican-American War, right? I mean, they occupy Mexico City. Like, they march troops down and occupy the capital. And there were some Americans who wanted to annex all of Mexico, right? Take the whole country, not just the northern, third or half of it. And those voices eventually get pushed aside. But yes, I mean, so the history of these countries is so wrapped up with each other. And what I find most interesting, right? Because like when most folks in the U.S. today think about Mexico, 2 things come to mind: drug trade and immigration.
Yes.
And when it comes to immigration, we really cannot understand Mexico's, the patterns of Mexican immigration to the U.S. if we don't understand how the U.S. has actually caused some of that migration, how the U.S. has actually spurred and propelled immigration into the U.S., which is a whole different story that, I don't know if you have the time to go into it, but there's all kinds of examples of how U.S. actions and interventions in Mexico have actually accelerated immigration to the U.S.
Please explain.
Okay. So there's the question of immigration law. So in 1924, the U.S. passes this really exclusive immigration law package. It's mainly aimed at keeping Europeans out. This period of Ellis Island, right? Lots and lots of Italian and Russian and Polish and whatever immigrants coming. So the U.S. is interested in passing, it's a very Trump-style immigration law in 1924. It's very exclusive, right? It's meant to block lots of people. And they passed this in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, but they have one exception. They say anyone from Mexico can come whenever. It's like, we're going to shut out Chinese, we're going to shut out Europeans, but Mexicans can still come. And the reason why is that some of the big agribusinesses in places like Colorado and Texas and California, they really depended upon cheap labor from Mexico. So they pushed Washington to say, well, let's exempt Mexicans.
Okay.
Right? So for like the next 40 years, while the country was really shut off to most other people, Mexicans were allowed to enter in unlimited numbers to the United States. Right? So in that sense, the U.S. already begins propelling, kind of building a migratory relationship with the U.S. Then during World War II, the U.S. the U.S. federal government actively begins recruiting Mexican immigrants to work in the U.S. under a program called the Bracero program. And bracero is just a word in Spanish meaning like manual laborer. Like brazo means arm, so it's like someone who works with their arms. So beginning in 1942 and then lasting all the way until 1965, the U.S. government gives like 5 million contracts to Mexican men to come and work in agriculture primarily and industry in the U.S. So like the federal government is overseeing the huge migration of Mexican workers to the United States that is completely legal. I mean, it's basically a guest worker program that is, once it comes to an end in 1965, it is going to, even after it ends, it's established these patterns and cycles, right? Like paths of migration, which are going to continue way after 1965, except, of course, by that time, they're now considered undocumented, even though the U.S. has been legally encouraging this for so many decades at that point.
Wow,
that's a big part of the story.
Well, that even happens today, right? They even have programs today. I recently had a guy who was born in San Diego, but his whole family lives in Tijuana. But his mom and his aunts, I guess, they cross the border every day to go work in a hotel in like San Diego or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, historically, there's been a lot of circular migration, a lot of back and forth, and most migration to the U.S. would have fallen into that category. But ever since the 1980s, when the U.S. has really been doubling down on like reinforcing the barrier and building fences and, making it harder and harder to cross, there's less and less circular migration, and there's much more permanent migration, which actually means that there'll be more and more immigrants who stay in the U.S. rather than if the borders were somewhat loose,
right?
Which is intriguing to think about. So, like when Reagan pushes through this big immigration law in the 1980s, the so-called IRCA,
right.
It was meant to, reduce the numbers of undocumented immigrants in the U.S., but it actually ends up raising them because people just decide that we're going to stay permanently rather than going back and forth like every season. So.
Right.
That's a separate topic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So explain like what happened after we basically drew that new border that gave us basically a giant chunk of Mexico, and it turned it into the United States. And some of those, like there was some sort of an agreement that had to be made where the people that were Mexicans living on this new part of the United States, former Mexico, they had to have some sort of like laws to make them citizens.
Yeah, right. And this gets at some really interesting riddles when it comes to ideas about race in America again. Right? So when the U.S. carves off this tremendous chunk of territory that they now call the United States, right, as a result of the Mexican-American War, there were hundreds of thousands of people living in that area. It's not like vacant territory. There's lots of people who consider themselves Nuevo Mexicanos, Californios, Tejanos, right? Spanish-speaking peoples who had been part of Mexico, but now, because of this war, are now part of the United States. And I like to think of these people as folks who didn't cross the border, but the border crossed them, quite literally, right? Like they literally get in a different country because the border just moved. So at the negotiating table in 1848, right, Mexico's just been defeated militarily by the U.S. So they don't have a ton of like clout and political capital to kind of bargain with, but they sit down with the Americans in the small town of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the center of Mexico, and they're working out the details of this peace treaty. And Mexico knows they're going to lose a ton of territory, right? But they're eager to push to make sure that these folks who are like, who just got captured by the U.S. by the border shifting, that they get a fair shake. The Mexican government wants to make sure that these former Mexicans have an opportunity not to be taken advantage of by their new American neighbors. So they work out the details of this in this treaty that says these folks should be allowed an opportunity to return to Mexico. In a sense, they're not returning at all. They're just moving into Mexico. Right. Or if they stay, they need to be granted U.S. citizenship. Right. That's basically the rule, the deal that the Mexican government is able to negotiate at the treaty. They say if these people stay, which most of them do, because who wants to move, right? It's good staying where you are. That they have to be given U.S. citizenship, and the U.S. government says yes, we will give citizenship to all these people. However, that puts the U.S. government in a bit of a pickle because it had laws at the time that said who's eligible to become a U.S. citizen. And the rule of the day said that there's only one group of people who are allowed to get U.S. citizenship, who are eligible for naturalization, right, for becoming a citizen. And there's three words that define that category: free white persons. They have to be a free white person in order to be eligible to naturalize. So what that means is that because the U.S. has now told the Mexican government that these, Nuevo Mexicanos and Californios are going to be Americans, that they are white. Because they're not going to change the law saying that, we should change it so, non-white people can become it. Instead, they're just going to say, all Mexicans are legally white.
Well, that goes against like the famous one drop rule that you mentioned. Where
one drop rule is more about African descent and about blackness than it is about, Mexicanness.
Okay.
But yeah, so it's somewhat of a separate issue for this. But yeah, basically in 1848, the U.S. says, all Mexicans are legally white. This is part of the reason why when you fill out a census form or something, like an employment form, you'll see that Latino or Hispanic or whatever they want to call it is not considered a racial category. It's considered something separate, right? Like you check white, black, Asian, whatever, but then there's a separate little thing that says
ethnicity,
exactly. Latino or Hispanic or something, right? With the sense that like you can be white and Latino, or you can be black and Latino, right? And there's lots of people in both those worlds who have
Right.
two heritages. So a lot of that kind of like weirdness about, well, what is race, what is ethnicity? It all stems from these strange rules that the U.S. put into effect in, you know, the 1840s, a really long time ago.
Wow.
And it still shapes us down to this present day.